The forest was thick with a quiet weight, a silence that clung to the air, heavier than the dense foliage above. The canopy filtered the sunlight, leaving the forest floor cloaked in shadows, where every leaf and branch seemed to whisper in the wind's slow sigh. In the heart of this forest lay a remote wildlife sanctuary, a place untouched by the hands of men for decades. The land, sprawling and untamed, was known for its dense underbrush, towering trees, and the deep sense of mystery that had long kept outsiders away. The animals roamed freely, and among them an ancient presence was thought to have vanished until now. The last confirmed sighting of the tiger had been over 20 years ago, when poaching had driven the majestic creatures to the brink of extinction in this region. Since then, the sanctuary had been a quiet refuge for the surviving wildlife, with the slow, steady pulse of life continuing without the fear of the striped predator. The head ranger, an old man named Suresh, had spent his life in this sanctuary, watching over the creatures with a mixture of respect and reverence. He knew the sounds of the forest like the back of his hand, the rhythmic call of the woodpecker, the rustle of deer in the underbrush, the distant cry of an eagle soaring high. But lately, something had been different. The first sign came in the form of broken branches, large ones, as though something heavy had moved through the dense woods. Then came the strange tracks, large paw prints with distinct, sharp claws that none of the sanctuary's inhabitants could have left. Suresh had no doubt the tiger had returned. The next few days were filled with unease. Suresh noticed the behaviors of the other animals beginning to shift. The deer, typically calm, had become skittish, often fleeing at the slightest noise. The monkeys had stopped their usual chatter, instead crouching low in the trees, their eyes scanning the ground below in a kind of terrified anticipation. Even the wind seemed to carry an undercurrent of warning, a subtle tremor that reached into the bones of anyone who listened closely enough. Suresh, with his weathered hands and a mind sharp as ever, decided to track the elusive predator. He had done this before, many years ago, when the forest was still teeming with the tigers that once roamed its heart. But this time was different. The tiger was no ordinary creature. This was a spirit of the wild, silent, elusive, and powerful. Days passed as Suresh ventured deeper into the forest, following the tracks, sensing the tiger's presence in every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a twig. His senses heightened, attuned to the smallest shifts in the environment. Yet, despite his efforts, the tiger remained elusive, as if it were toying with him, slipping through his grasp like mist. Then, one afternoon, the forest went deathly still. No birds chirped. The breeze ceased. Even the rustling leaves stopped. Suresh froze in place, his heart pounding in his chest. He had learned long ago that the stillness of the forest was a warning something was near, something dangerous. He crouched low, his every muscle tensed. He could feel it, the presence. The tiger was here. Suddenly, the underbrush behind him rustled. Suresh spun around, but it was too late. In a flash, the tiger lunged from the shadows, its orange and black coat gleaming like liquid fire in the dappled light. The sheer force of the tiger's movement knocked Suresh off his feet. The predator's, eyes pale, amber, filled with ancient wisdom, locked onto his for a heartbeat, before the tiger disappeared into the underbrush, as silently as it had appeared. Suresh lay there, heart racing, breath shallow. He could hear the distant thump of his pulse in his ears, but the forest around him remained eerily quiet. The tiger was gone, but the air had shifted. He could feel it. The tiger wasn't just here. It was watching him, following him. Over the next several days, Suresh's fear deepened. The encounters became more frequent. In the dead of night, he would hear the heavy footfalls of the tiger's movement, the low growl of warning in the distance. Each time, the tiger seemed closer, its presence more pronounced, but it never attacked. It never made its move. It simply watched, waited. As days turned into weeks, The tiger had come back to reclaim its territory, but there was more to it. He could sense it. It was not just a return of a predator to its home. No, this was something more profound, something ancient. And then, one evening, as the sky painted itself with shades of orange and red, a strange event occurred. Suresh was walking through a particularly dense part of the forest, near the river that had once been a favorite hunting ground for the tigers. He knelt to drink from his water bottle when he heard at the faintest sound, a soft footfall behind him. He turned quickly, but the clearing was empty. A sudden gust of wind swept through the trees, and for a split second, Suresh thought he saw something flash between the trunks, a flicker of gold and black, so quick it was almost a mirage. His breath caught in his throat. The tiger wasn't hunting him. It was leading him. He hesitated, unsure of his next step, but something inside him, the same instinct that had guided him for years, pushed him forward. He followed the flash of the tiger's movements through the forest, heart pounding as the air seemed to thicken with anticipation. After what felt like an eternity of tense movement through the trees, the forest opened into a clearing, a place that had once been a home for many animals, the sanctuary's most sacred place, a quiet glade surrounded by ancient, towering trees. But now, it was different. The tiger stood in the center of the clearing, staring directly at him. But as Suresh approached, he saw the tiger was not alone. The ground was covered with the delicate tracks of several other animals, the unmistakable mark of a return, a reclamation of the sanctuary by the creatures that once roamed it freely. The tiger turned, its tail flicking once, before it disappeared into the trees once more. And in that moment, Suresh understood. The tiger had returned not just to reclaim its territory, but to bring balance back to the forest, to restore the old ways. The sanctuary, once a safe haven, had become imbalanced, overrun by creatures that had flourished without natural predators. The tiger's return was the forest's way of reminding all who lived there of the delicate harmony that existed between predator and prey. Suresh stood silently in the glade, a deep sense of reverence settling over him. The tiger had not just returned. It had become the keeper of balance, a force that could not be ignored. And now, it was up to him to ensure that the sanctuary would remain a place of true harmony where all creatures could thrive as nature intended. As the last light of day faded, Suresh made his way back, the eerie stillness of the forest settling around him once more. The tiger was watching, as always, its eyes gleaming in the shadows, knowing that its return had set in motion something far greater than he could have ever imagined. As Suresh made his way back to the sanctuary's base, the weight of what he had witnessed settled on him like a heavy cloak. His feet moved almost mechanically, but his mind was alive with thoughts of the tiger, of balance, of the deeper meaning behind its silent return. There had been no aggression, no attack. The tiger had not come to dominate. It had come to restore. The sounds of the forest had returned to their usual rhythm, the faint calls of birds overhead, the rustle of leaves as small creatures moved through the undergrowth. But beneath it all, there was an unsettling silence, as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Suresh couldn't shake the feeling that he had just witnessed the beginning of something far more profound, something he was only beginning to understand. As night fell, the world outside grew darker, and the firelight from the sanctuary's base flickered like a tiny beacon in the vast wilderness. Suresh sat on a weathered wooden bench, staring into the fire, the crackling sound filling the silence of the night. His thoughts kept returning to the clearing, to the tiger, to the way it had moved, so deliberate, so sure of itself. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, of respect for the creature that had come back, not to claim power, but to remind the world of the delicate threads that tied all life together. The next morning, Suresh woke early, as he always did, to the first light of dawn. The sanctuary was still too still. The usual chorus of birdsong was absent, and there was a heaviness to the air. He had grown accustomed to the rhythms of the forest, He ventured out into the woods, his boots crunching softly on the leaf-covered ground. The tiger's presence still loomed in his mind. He sensed something else, a shift. The forest was holding its breath again, but this time there was an urgency to it, an underlying tension that made every step he took feel like a quiet reckoning. Suresh made his way to the clearing. He needed to understand, needed to see for himself if the tiger's return had truly changed the balance of the forest. As he approached the familiar glade, he stopped short. The ground, which had been littered with tracks the day before, was now eerily smooth. The signs of movement were gone, as though they had never been there at all. His heart quickened, and he knelt to the earth, brushing aside the fallen leaves. There were no fresh tracks, no signs of life. The forest felt unnaturally still, as if holding a secret just out of reach. He stood up, scanning the trees around him. He had come to understand the rhythms of the wild, but today the forest felt like a puzzle with pieces missing. What had happened overnight? Why had the tiger's return left no trace behind? Suddenly, a faint sound broke the silence. It wasn't the tiger. This growl was deeper, more guttural, filled with a sense of warning, a low vibration that seemed to hum through the very air. Suresh's eyes widened and his pulse quickened. He was no longer alone in the clearing. From the shadows at the edge of the glade, a large, dark shape emerged, a bear. Its fur thick and matted, its eyes glinting with a strange intensity. It was much larger than any bear Suresh had seen before. The air around it felt heavier, as though its very presence was challenging the delicate balance the tiger had sought to restore. The bear paused at the edge of the clearing, its massive form silhouetted against the trees. It sniffed the air, its nostrils flaring. For a long moment, the two creatures, Suresh and the bear, studied each other from a distance. The bear's growl rumbled again, low and powerful. It was a warning. Suresh slowly backed away, his mind racing. He had seen bears before, but never one with this kind of presence, the sense of dominance. It wasn't just hungry, it was territorial, challenging the very order of the forest. Was this the reason the tiger had returned? To confront the shifting power dynamics that were emerging in its absence. As Suresh moved, the bear's gaze never left him, and he could feel the tension building. His heart pounded in his chest, and the air grew thick with the weight of an unspoken battle. The balance was tipping again, and this time Suresh wasn't sure what would come next. With one last, lingering look at the massive creature, Suresh turned and retreated into the forest, moving as quietly as possible. Every part of him felt the pull of danger, the deep, primal instinct that told him to move fast, to leave this place before the balance shifted further. Back at the sanctuary base, Suresh gathered his thoughts. The tiger had come to restore balance, but the forest was changing. The bear's presence was a sign that something else was at play. A new force was moving in, one that threatened to disrupt the delicate equilibrium. The tiger might have returned to reclaim its role as the predator, but now it was up against a new challenge, one it hadn't faced before. Suresh knew the task before him was more urgent than ever. The sanctuary had been a safe haven, a sanctuary in every sense of the word. But now, that sanctuary was under threat, just from outside forces, but from the very forces of nature that were beginning to clash. The return of the tiger had set something in motion, and Suresh could no longer remain an observer. He had to step in to ensure that the balance remained. As he sat down to formulate his next steps, the sound of the wind began to rise, filling the air with a soft, mournful hum. It seemed to echo through the trees, as though the forest itself was calling out, waiting for someone to listen, to act. The balance of the sanctuary, and perhaps the entire forest, now rested on a razor's edge. Suresh knew that the tiger's return was not the end of the story, it was just the beginning. And whatever came next, he would have to face it head-on, with the forest's future in his hands. And deep in the shadows, The tiger watched its amber eyes gleaming with silent understanding. The battle for the forest was not yet over. The days that followed felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. Suresh didn't sleep well. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the bear in the clearing, the growl reverberating in his bones. It wasn't just the bear, it was the shift in the air, the warning that something was changing and that balance was no longer a certainty. The tiger had returned, yes, but now it seemed to be locked in a struggle much larger than itself. Suresh spent his time walking the perimeter of the sanctuary, checking the traps, ensuring the safety of the wildlife. But even as he worked, he couldn't shake the sense that the forest was watching him, its vastness and mystery growing more daunting with each passing day. The animals that usually made their presence known through the hum of the woods were quieter, as if anticipating something unseen. The forest felt like a place suspended in time, teetering on the edge of some unspoken reckoning. The tiger, though, had not been seen since Suresh's encounter. No signs of its tracks, no distant glimpses through the underbrush. Only the unsettling emptiness remained. The bear, on the other hand, had begun to make its presence known more frequently. Its growl could be heard at the edge of the sanctuary's grounds, deep in the woods where the trees stood thick and silent. One afternoon, as Suresh sat by the window in the small cabin that served as the sanctuary's base, his eyes darted to the forest. Something in the distance caught his attention, a shift in the shadows, a movement that was too deliberate to be the wind. He stood up quickly, his heart skipping a beat. This wasn't just a passing creature. This felt like something bigger, something heavier in the air. Suresh grabbed his field journal and made his way to the back door. The wind had started to pick up, carrying with it the scent of something unusual, a mixture of wet earth, pine, and an underlying sharpness. He moved carefully, his senses on high alert, trying to tune into the rhythm of the forest. The familiar sounds of the woods, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed muted now. Even the wind sounded muffled, as though it were trying to hush itself. Suresh's heart raced in his chest as he reached the tree line, his eyes scanning the landscape for any sign of movement. Then he saw it. It was the bear again. Its presence was so palpable now, its movements methodical and slow, as if it were claiming its territory one step at a time. It was moving closer, and Suresh could sense the primal tension in the air, the forest urging him to turn back before it was too late. But as he watched, something unexpected happened. The bear stopped in its tracks, its head jerking up, its nostrils flaring. It sniffed the air, then turned its body slightly, as if sensing something or someone else in the woods. Suresh's breath caught in his throat. Was it the tiger? A low growl rolled from the bear's throat, but it wasn't aimed at Suresh. It was directed toward the deeper shadows of the forest, where the trees grew thick and dark. The growl was followed by another, a sound that made the ground tremble slightly, deep and guttural. The air was thick with tension, like a storm was about to break. Suresh dared not move. His eyes stayed fixed on the bear, watching its every subtle motion. The bear stood as still as a statue, its muscles coiled, its gaze locked on something hidden in the trees. Then there was a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle from the undergrowth, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind. And then, like a shadow creeping out of the dark, a figure appeared. It was the tiger, silent. It moved with the grace of a predator, its amber eyes locked onto the bear's every move. The two creatures stood facing each other across a stretch of dense foliage, the air thick with a sense of ancient power. The bear didn't make another move. The tiger didn't either. For a long moment, it felt as though time itself had frozen in place, the two forces of nature locked in a battle of wills. Suresh, hidden in the shadows of the trees, held his breath, watching the confrontation unfold with the intensity of someone witnessing a moment that would change the course of everything. Then, slowly, with a quiet grace that almost seemed to surprise Suresh, it didn't look back, its body moving with an elegance that contrasted the tension just moments before. The The bear stood for a few more seconds, then turned its massive body, lumbering back into the deeper recesses of the forest. Suresh stood there for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the woods closing in around him like a heavy fog. He had witnessed something extraordinary. The tiger had not fought. It had simply asserted its presence and then stepped away, as if recognizing that the time for confrontation had not yet come. When he finally returned to the sanctuary, the weight of what he had seen felt like a new understanding settling deep within him. The tiger wasn't just an apex predator. It was a symbol of balance, a force that could not be ignored, but also one that knew when to retreat, when to allow nature to find its own course. The bear, too, was not a mindless destroyer, was a guardian of its domain, a creature that protected what it had claimed. And now, the delicate balance between them had been established once more. Suresh knew that the story of the tiger and the bear was far from over. The forest was changing, and there would be more tests ahead. But in that moment, he felt a deep sense of hope. The tiger had returned to restore the balance, and it had done so with silent wisdom. It had reminded him of the deep connection all creatures shared in this wild world, each one with a role, each one with a place. And as he sat down once again by the fire, the forest around him seemed quieter now, the tension of the day settling into a peaceful stillness. But deep in the shadows, beneath the trees and the rising moon, he knew the battle was not yet over. The balance was fragile, but for the moment, it held, and that was enough.